that's perfect. Can you just take a few minutes in conclusion? You're somebody, fit this in. I mean, you not only, I think and I regret this. I read you, I took it in, but I just sort of from across the Atlantic accepted the political capitulation of Corbyn and McDonnell to Brexit to Remain forces, I should say. Now, you were undeniably correct on the politics, and this is one of those things that I think, and whatever, we all, everybody, we want people to be shifting and reformulating, but I do want to note it's something that several months ago was very controversial terrain for you to take out. Now everybody just sort of accepts it. And it should be noted that you were correct early, not just as a question of ego, but as a question of pointing to the quality of your analysis and seeing. So we all see that fight, maybe you protected some Lib Dem votes in London, but you consolidated the loss of the heartland of Labour, particularly with a very savvy campaign that Boris Johnson ran, which I think is another conversation for another day. But you also supported Brexit actually on the merits, a sort of left Brexit position. With that in mind, what is Corona doing to the European project? And I guess with the paradox that through you and others, I've become much more critical, and I've kind of let go of some of my sort of American delusions about the Europeans, and what they did to Greece really helped. And at the same time, I don't fetishize a return to closed nationalism. I mean, this is precisely a moment for deep grounded internationalism. Mm-hmm. So how do you kind of put those things together to read what's happening in Europe at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing is that absolutely. I mean, I should say 15, maybe 20 years ago, if this issue had come up, my view would have been stay in and change the European Union. But 10, 15 more years of professionally, through what I teach law and I research and work in that area, and then also politically through various things that I've been engaged in, coming to understand the reality of the actually existing European Union as opposed to the sort of idealized version of it, that it is a fundamental fetter, both short term in Syriza was the obvious example of that, and also longer term. If we had got a Corbyn led left government elected in Britain and we're still in the European Union, they wouldn't have been neutral on any even modest program of redistribution, nationalisation, and so forth. So for me, the socialist arguments for leaving the European Union are sort of incontrovertible in that sense, and I think that's been one of the. It's a really crucial point. And again, I've said it to someone recently that Brexit for people on the left, so Brexit for socialists and people who consider themselves socialists and Marxists, anarchists, whatever it might be, wasn't really fundamentally about staying in or leaving the European Union. It was a litmus test of the level of analysis, and most of the left failed in that sense, right? Because basically, most of the left, rather than engaging in serious socialist or Marxist analysis, devolved into liberal analysis and basically went, well, Brexit has been called by a racist right-wing government, and it's supported by racists, and so it's a racist thing, and therefore we must oppose it. And it's absolutely undeniable that racism and anti-migrant sentiment and so forth was a part of the sort of surface level of the Brexit conjuncture, in the same way in which sort of nativist racism was part of Trump's victory in the US. But if all you're looking at is the surface, then you're not doing socialist or Marxist politics. If you don't understand Brexit as part of a sort of structural crisis of the capitalist system, which has been unfolding, not just since 2008, but actually since sort of early 70s, which the current EU was a reaction to. The current EU and the single market and so forth was a reaction to the crises of the 70s in an attempt to overcome that and locked in the gains of neoliberalism. And the failure of the British, most of the British left, with some honourable exceptions in the RMT trade union, for example, one of the most militant trade unions in the UK, they had a socialist leave position from the outset, and a few others did as well. But the failure to understand that speaks to a couple of things. It speaks to analytical sort of failure and a failure to properly grasp it in a socialist and the Marxist way, but also, again, to this disconnect from the class. Because if you had been embedded, if the Labour Party had been embedded properly in working class communities, and this isn't just sometimes people simplistically try to draw a distinction between northern working class here in the UK and the sort of southern metropolitan, whatever it is. I lived in London until very recently. I lived in a very sort of diverse community in North London, mostly Kurdish and Turkish, very working class and so forth. Nobody there cared about a second referendum on Brexit. They were concerned with the sort of cost of transport, the cost of accommodation in London. They were fighting over the attempts to demolish schools in the area. They were concerned with cuts to the healthcare sector. They were concerned with bread and butter stuff. The second vote, people's vote thing, was a middle class movement. It was a middle class campaign. These are the sort of people whose politics was formed during the sort of halcyon days of the credit fueled bubble of the last 15 years and the rising house prices and rising asset prices. People who want the restoration, the same sort of people who would like Hillary Clinton to be president, who want things just to go back to the way they were when it was sort of endless spending on credit cards and there was no sort of problems on the horizon. And that wasn't something that a socialist movement could tap into. That's not something that a socialist movement could channel and work with. And also wasn't something that socialist movement should want to. So there was the principled socialist case for leaving the European Union, and then there was also pragmatic political arguments. Because again, I campaigned in the last election. I'm not actually on the sort of introduction. I'm not in Labour. I supported Corbyn. I work with people in Labour, but I'm not in Labour because it's not really for me in terms of what it's about fundamentally. But I did support a campaign in the last election for some fantastic candidates, in particular Laura Smith and crew, who unfortunately lost their seat. But if you went out there, you saw the anger straight away. You knocked on people's doors and you were walking in there and saying, we're going to give you free broadband. We're going to nationalise the education system. We're going to do a whole range of these radical changes. That one thing you've had a choice on, that one policy issue that you've been given a choice on the last 40 years, we're not going to do that. And we've got this sort of half-arsed way of saying we're going to have a second referendum in which Corbyn will stay neutral. So, and
it always struck me that when you'd watch Tony Blair talk about the European Union, and I have my, whatever. I have my own issues I have to work out with Tony Blair. I should hate him more. I do hate him, but I should hate him more. But you could watch Tony Blair, and from the perspective of a right-wing, 90s style neoliberal who was looking at Europe maintaining relevance in a G2 world, his arguments made a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And then McConnell and Corbyn, who are obviously better people in every shape and form with an actual vision for society and internationalism, when they would say it, they just sounded like, hey, I'm a socialist, but I've read a couple of FT columns and it would be really bad. It just doesn't sound compelling.
It doesn't. And that's actually one of the crucial things. I mean, again, it will remain to be seen what happens in the US election in due course. I don't hold out much hope of sort of the weekend that Bernie's candidate defeating Trump. So I don't sort of see that happening. But this is the thing about the politics we're in now and the conjuncture we're in now. There's a fundamental structural crisis in the system. And again, it's been unfolding for quite a long period of time, but particularly since 2008, it's been acute. And the thing is that this is why Corbyn and Brexit are so intimately related. The Brexit vote, the Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party. It was unforeseen. It was a sort of historical accident. The Brexit vote happened, and the subsequent general election 2007 was the biggest increase in Labour's vote since World War II, delivered by Corbyn, making it an offer of change, effectively an offer of sort of, we call it socialism, but basically soft social democracy. And those two things are so intimately linked because both of them reflected a desire and an attempt to grasp an alternative to the status quo. The problem was when the last election came around, Labour had been co-opted into a restoration of the status quo ante. Labour then had effectively become the party that was saying, we're going to undo Brexit, but they wouldn't even say it honestly, which made it worse, because one of the things that made Corbyn such a compelling figure was his honesty and his authenticity. And he's somebody who was arrested protesting against apartheid in the 70s and 80s, who's been consistent on these issues. And suddenly in the last election, he's doing interviews on TV where he says, we'll have another referendum if we win the election. We'll have another referendum and I'll remain neutral on it. And people are looking at going, well, hang on, you're just another one of them. You're just another one of these lawyers. And on the other hand, you have this absolute sort of charlatan in Boris Johnson, sort of dripping privilege from every pore, but he gets to spin himself as the insurgent outsider candidate, the one who's opposing all of these people who are trying to stop Brexit and everything else. And it was a clear-cut Brexit election, and Labour tried to make it about everything except Brexit, and that was never going to happen. I mean, again, it's one of those things that the left campaign, which I'm involved with, we supported Labour in the election and so forth, but we'd prepared their analysis of the outcome of the election a week and a half in advance of any actual results, because it was clear how it was going. The actual aggregate numbers in terms of the Conservative Party lead didn't really change throughout the course of the election. Some polls put them much further ahead, some polls put them a little closer, but the aggregate numbers, it remained between sort of 8% and 6% Conservative at all points throughout the election. And that's another thing then, is that the soft left in the UK during the election was caught up in the sort of delusions of the moment that we're going to win this, the vote will go higher. But objectively, that was just never the case. And again, you have to be, this goes back to Cabral. I'm far too strict a Cabralist for my own good sometimes, is that you can't bullshit people. You can't tell people we're going to win. And this is sometimes, you'll often see people invoke Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, right? Optimism of the will and will from optimism are two very different things. The optimism of the will means getting up and going, this is an absolutely horrendous situation. We've got all these different factors against us. But if we understand the sort of imminent tendencies within the system, if we understand the role that the working class can play in transforming this, there are ways we can turn this around. There are pressure points we can put on. It doesn't mean looking at a situation and then sort of Peter Pan like wishing enough in order to change it. It means actually sort of understanding the system and then working to turn it around. And the problem we've had here, sorry, when I go back to the EU, so the whole thing question of the EU, most of the British left didn't grasp what was going on. They got caught up in liberal moralism about racism and so forth, and sort of dropped the ball completely. And that's also because the membership of a lot of the left groups isn't embedded in the working class community. Because again, if you were properly and strongly rooted in working class communities, when somebody came along and said, you know what, instead of respecting the vote like we said we'd do in 2017, we should actually come out now and say we're going to go for a second vote, they'd be laughed out of the room. But because it wasn't that, it was sort of professional pollsters and so forth in a room compiling data and saying, oh well, we could possibly get this seat and possibly get that seat, and it became crass sort of electoralism without any serious vision. But in terms of what Corona has done to the EU, so for the last few years, as the Brexit debate has dragged on here, I've been involved in a number of discussions, and in almost all of them, I've said to people that I'd be very surprised if the EU survives as it's currently constituted when the next crisis hits. So the last crisis of 2008 and the Eurozone crisis and the treatment of Greece, of Spain, of Portugal, of Italy, of Ireland really exposed the contradictions at the heart of the EU, the sort of core periphery divergence, the sort of inequality between states, the inequality of power and so forth. And it was very unlikely that when the next crisis hit, that those institutions would survive. And we've seen just in the last few days, Corona has hit. It's unprecedented. So it's not. I'm sure you've heard or read Rob Wallace's work on on the coronavirus and so forth. And if anybody's looking to get a sort of serious grasp on what's going on, Rob Wallace's work is excellent. So the fact that the crisis wasn't unanticipated, the nature of this particular crisis is surprising in terms of how it turned up in the form of this virus and so forth, and unprecedented in that sense. And the cost of it in terms of what it's doing to the economies, you've seen some of the headline figures sort of from Wall Street, the sort of loss of 27% of value in the second quarter. The UK economy due to contract by 35% this year. One estimate that the EU states collectively will need to spend 1.5 trillion just this year in order to keep things on track. Now, one response to that is the states in the EU, Italy in particular, France also even, who have suffered over the last 10 years with austerity imposed by the EU and who are in a weak position financially and economically, asked, playing back this language of European solidarity and so forth, asked the burden of meeting the coronavirus crisis be shared amongst the member states. They were pushing the idea of corona bonds, so that basically it would allow all of the member states of the EU to pool their resources and to an extent pool their liabilities, which would allow these governments in the poorer countries to borrow at lower interest rates and to not worry about massive debts on the other side of the crisis. Well, that was shot down straight away by the Dutch and crucially by the Germans. There was a meeting just a few days ago where this was effectively rejected. They've announced a package of 500 billion, but most of that 500 billion will be in the form of loans or grants, which of course will have to be paid back. So it will be a perpetuation of the austerity cycle within the EU, which again reinforces the socialist arguments against the European Union. Because again, the great delusion of people like Yanis Varoufakis and many on the British left was that you should remain in and reform the European Union. And again, it's not something I'd say lightly. If I thought we could reform the European Union, I'd argue for staying in and doing so. But structurally and constitutionally, it's designed to be beyond any meaningful reform. It's designed to be beyond democratic control and accountability, and also because of the political economy of European integration, the trajectory of it. Again, it's always been the case that the EU is going to get increasingly neoliberal. I think that neoliberal is the wrong word, but increasingly authoritarian and increasingly putting pressure on these peripheral states to privatise further sectors of the economy, to pay off debts that are sort of unsustainable and so forth. So the coronavirus has again exposed the character of the European Union, the absolute delusion of the idea of European solidarity, and it hasn't vindicated Brexit. Brexit, again, one of the things about Brexit is that Brexit is a process, and that's been one of the problems for people as well. There's a lot of talk about cliff edge and falling off and everything else, but Brexit isn't an event. It isn't something that happens on a day. It's a process. And again, the Left campaign, which I work with, we were set up, and the whole argument we were making from the start was that the fight isn't about whether we leave or not. That should be settled and should have been settled. And part of what we tried to do was fight a rearguard action against Labour, taking the disastrous decision to back a second referendum. But the real fight has always been about what will Britain look like going forward. But to go back to your point then about not retreating into nationalism, you probably guess from the accent I'm not British, and I'm certainly not a British nationalist. So my support for Brexit doesn't come from that perspective.
No
but
way.
On that point, it was an important thing that, and I wrote a small article for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and Trademark Belfast on this, because sections of the British, effectively the sort of the right of the Labour Party and so forth, were painting themselves as internationalists, and that's why we have to stay in the European Union. But it's important then that we contest this. It's important that we say that what you get with the EU isn't internationalism. You get a truncated cosmopolitanism that benefits capital and doesn't benefit workers, doesn't benefit migrants, doesn't benefit the countries of the global south, who the EU is pillaging through sort of bilateral trade agreements and so forth. So it's not the internationalism of the working class. And then ironically, or not ironically actually, but without wanting to get too sort of clunky, but like dialectically, that actually rupturing with the EU, which ostensibly looks like a retreat to nationalism, is actually a precondition for advancing internationalism. So it's not the surface level stuff again, it's more complex, and we had to do that. But then also in the UK, a lot of that argument was scuppered and scuttled because the decision was taken. I mean, that was one of the key things as well, the democratic argument. Once the vote was taken, and it was a close vote, but once that decision was taken, for Labour to allow itself to become the party of frustrating the single biggest democratic exercise in British history, while also claiming to be the party of fundamental transformation, it just didn't stack up, and it involved a certain level of sort of bubble thinking to be able to get to that point.
Paul O'Connell, I always appreciate your time so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Just learned so much, and I can't wait to talk to you again soon.
Thanks again. So take care. All right. Be safe.
Take care. Be safe. Get good rest. Take care.
You just watched a Michael Brooks Show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.